We'll see what happens at 10:15 a.m. tomorrow. Clearly the High Court not really watching on, caring much about what's happening with the budget, but I'm sure my next two guests are Tim Watts and Amanda Stoker. Thanks very much for your time today.
No problem.
Let's start on, well, I guess what's the big discussion today from Labor's point of view is about deficit. It's an interesting situation, isn't it, that Tony Abbott railed about debt and deficit when he was opposition leader. In reality, you could be pledging to have smaller surpluses than Labor over the next 4 years.
I guess the difference is that we inherited from Labor an awful mess post-GFC, where there was reckless spending beyond anything that this nation really could bear. We've had to clean up that mess, as well as planning for the future. And this government has been quite effective in turning that situation around, and we now look like we'll be in a position to have a balanced budget and start dealing with things like the debt from the past. We'll see
what exact number you'll get to, but it is worth mentioning, Tim Watts, you're going to seemingly have bigger surpluses, pay off the debt. You are getting there through higher taxes. I mean, that's just a fact, isn't it?
Well, we shouldn't let Amanda's point slide here, Tom. What we've seen over the last 4 years, the last 5 years, is a doubling of net debt. Now, Malcolm Turnbull got around as opposition leader with his debt truck, complaining about the level of debt in Australia, and under his prime ministership, he's doubled it. It's gone from a debt truck to Truckosaurus, right? It's out of control. Now, if you want to give them credit for reducing the debt coming out in the out years, that's a function of prevailing economic conditions. They haven't made the tough decisions. They have let bracket creep grow. They've let inertia determine their fiscal policy, their tax policy, and this is where it's led them.
Well, not total inertia. I mean, they've introduced a company tax cut as an example. That's their plan to grow the economy. But in plain speaking English, you are going to take a plan to have bigger surpluses, pay off more debt. It is, you said, tough decisions. They are decisions to tax the economy more. That's a fact, isn't it?
We've been upfront and we want to tackle the Australian tax system and make it fairer. We don't think it's fair that the Australian tax system currently disperses $11 billion a year on tax incentives for property investors. That's more than we spend on universities. We don't think it's fair that we spend, we'll soon spend $5 billion a year in free money, not tax refundants, free money to retirees who don't pay tax just for owning shares. That's more than the Commonwealth Government spends on public schools. So, yeah, we're up front in saying that we think that those tax concessions are not fair. We're going to fix them. And they're the kinds of tough decisions governments need to make to bring the budget back into surplus.
I want to ask you about the income tax cut. It's the sweet spot at $90,000 gets people, I think, about $25 a fortnight. What should they do with that?
Look, the great thing about tax cuts is that people can decide for themselves what they want to do with it. The difference between the government, who is committed to reducing income taxes, to reducing the taxes that are faced by small and medium-sized businesses in particular, and we'd love to see business taxes cut across the board so that we can keep growing the economy. The big difference is if the people of Australia had a Labor government, they'd be facing about $200 billion more in taxes. Taxes on housing, electricity, small business, investment, income, pensions. I mean, they want to hit everything with more tax. So in terms of which side is better placed to give people a real choice about what they do with their money, it's got to be the government.
But the $25, how would you frame that? Remember, this is the best possible tax cut someone would get. How would you frame that?
Well, look, the great thing about tax cuts is that it sends a signal that, one, they're not going up, which is a hell of a lot different to what you're getting from Labor.
Well, Labor's not going to increase the income tax, but
overall, the tax burden's going to grow significantly. It means that people have some certainty about the position they face. They know that they're not going to face increases in taxes, and they can do what they like. And in circumstances where all of the efforts of the coalition are being directed to economic growth, jobs growth, wages growth, then we can plan for a future in which everybody's got more in their pocket. It's
not going to change anyone's life or even situation, is it?
Well, the combination, $25 is a small amount, right? You compare it to what's on offer from Labor, it looks pretty darn good. And then when you take it into account with the other economic improvements that this government is delivering, people are going to face much better financial circumstances across the board.
What do you make of the tax cut on the table that we've heard about, Tim?
It's a bit confusing for me, Tom, frankly, because if we were having this interview at this time last year, we would have been talking about Scott Morrison's plan to increase a Medicare levy, a tax increase on middle and working class Australians that would have hit everyone, right? So
But which
they've
isn't going
changed.
ahead, which is great.
Thanks to the Labor Party. So, appreciate your support, Amanda. We stopped that going through the Parliament. Now Scott Morrison has backed down.
It's thanks, though, that really to the economy going better. So
No, it's thanks to the Labor Party continuing to hold the line in the
sure,
Parliament.
but there could have easily been a situation where a year later, if the levy had somehow passed, they would have given a bigger income tax cut, if you like. But what do you make of the 25? Do you think Labor needs to outbid it? Is it not significant enough to make a difference?
Well, you asked earlier, Amanda, how you frame this $25 tax cut. The way to frame it is to say this is a measure of this government's priorities. They can find $80 billion of tax cuts for big corporates, $17 billion of tax cuts for the big banks in Australia, and the best that you'll do out of them in income tax is about $25 a week, more likely $10 a week. So Malcolm Turnbull, yet again, showing he's for the top end of town, he's for the big banks. Labor has been the only party in this parliament in the fight for working and middle class families.
Well, but hang on, it's how you frame it. I mean, you could call this a $50 billion over 10-year tax cut. It sounds bigger that way, but the way you're talking, it sounds as though you think Labor needs to offer a better income tax cut.
Well, we are in a stronger fiscal position to have optionality going forward, Tom, because we have made the tough decisions. We have looked at the Australian tax system, identified where there are these unfairnesses, where there are policies that, frankly, no other country in the world replicate, like that free money for retirees who pay no tax just for owning shares. No other country in the world does that. We've said we'll be upfront, we'll get rid of it, and that gives us the option to use the tax system in ways that are a greater priority for us.
But if you don't use it in that way, people aren't any better off. So you're saying you've got optionality, but you need to outbid them on this income tax cut, do you?
Well, there are multiple ways that we can use it, Tom. I mean, if we look at the budget tonight, we'll see $17 billion of cuts to schools in Australia. We'll see $700 million of cuts to hospitals. So schools, hospitals,
the funding's
tax
still
relief,
going up. They're not cuts.
These are cuts from the promises that when Malcolm Turnbull promised, when Tony Abbott, you lose track with this mob, promised that they would match funding for schools dollar for dollar. That's not happening. There's a $17 billion delta.
All right, but just on this income tax cut then, you've got that optionality, but you'd agree if you are going to eventually tax various Australians through various ways, negative gearing, trusts, franked dividends as well, that some of that needs to go back in a more generous income tax cut than $25 a fortnight tops.
It is something that I'd like to see, Tom, but we should make the point that this is not the taxes that you were talking about there earlier, the dividend imputation reforms that Labor has taken the decision to do, 80% of that is enjoyed by the 20% of the wealthiest families in Australia. So middle and working class families are already being protected by Labor. We stopped the increase of the Medicare levy. We've been in there fighting for them through the whole 5 years.
Do voters come up to you a lot and talk about the national debt?
People do say they want a government that is going to take financial responsibility seriously. And I'm really pleased to see Scott Morrison come out this morning and say that making sure that this government lives within its means is one of our top 5 priorities. I think that's a really important message to send. What I hear a lot is people who are retirees, particularly self-funded retirees, being very frustrated by the prospect of a Labor government that wants to have them under siege.
On the debt, though, what did you make of Peter Costello's comments last night?
Look, I'd like to see his reaction tomorrow, because once we know the full details of the budget, I hold out a hope that I don't think is unreasonable, that he'll be pleasantly surprised.
There you go. I'm sure people will be getting his reaction once it is handed down. And just on a sort of debt and trust with voters, because Wayne Swan did fail to deliver a surplus. He spoke about a lot, he promised, he put in budgets. Part of you pledging for more debt repair, is that winning back the trust of voters in this area of policy?
We need to be clear about our history here, Tom. There was a little thing called the global financial crisis that happened during the last Labor government. Wayne Swan did the right thing during the global financial crisis, saved 200,000 jobs in the Australian economy, kept people in the workforce. That was enormously important. We had a targeted intervention during that period. This mob they're downhill skiers. The economic conditions
some of
are
it-
improving,
right,
and they're
no,
taking the
there's no
credit
doubt
for
it's
that.
improving.
Good work.
No, there's no doubt it's improving now, but some of that wasn't all that targeted. And even towards the end, I mean, these estimates for year after year had been disappointing. Many economists, much more seasoned than me, were saying these are not believable surpluses. Did you lose some trust with voters there about debt and deficit?
So, Tom, the interventions that we made were absolutely gold class. You go early, you go hard, you go families. That's the way you respond to an international recession.
Pink bats,
We kept-
unnecessary school halls.
Well, you talk to the schools in your electorates about those unnecessary school halls, because I have events in them every day of the week, and I can tell you, my principals love them.
So you don't think there's any legacy, though, from those years with voters, Labor, debt at all?
Voters want to see fiscal responsibility in Australia. There's no doubt about that. We need to get the budget under control, and that's why they've been exasperated to see a coalition that campaigned on a debt and deficit disaster, that this was a crisis, that you had to burn the house down to stop this happening. They've gone and doubled net debt. Like, how does that make sense? I mean, there's the ones whose credibility is sorely lacking on this issue.
I want to ask you, Amanda Stoker, about your predecessor. Apparently, and this is not the question, but he did his Achilles playing tennis, so hopefully he's okay. But George Brandis has also spoken about right-wing ideology of Tony Abbott. Is that something you agree with?
Look, I hear his Achilles is healing well. I
Very
ran
good.
into him shortly before he left, and everything seemed to be on the mend. Look, it's not certainly borne out by my experience so far. I think you've got a pretty balanced set of beliefs in the team, and it's pretty hard to see
All
how...
right. I'm going to jump in there because there is a division. I think Tim Watts has to go. I'm not sure about that.
Gotta love you and leave you, Amanda. I need to vote.
Nice to chat with you. Sorry,
Continue though, it's just Tim apparently, so no, she needs to go as well. I'm not sure what's happening here. We might go to some more news. Amanda Stoker, look, it's always live and fluid here on Sky News, so we'll speak to you next time.
Thanks.
See how the budget